Okay, so we are recording, and let me share the screen. Okay, so before I start, are there any questions?
Sir, I had a doubt.
Yes.
So, in the slide where we discuss comparative statics, the case where the production costs increase, can you please go to?
Yes, I'll go there. Apparently, you can't see me. You can only see my bookshelf. Well, my virtual bookshelf. Can you see me on the video?
No, sir.
No, sir.
Oh, of course. If there's no camera, you won't be able to see me naturally. All right.
Now it's visible.
What principle?
Yes, sir.
What principle, Mitali?
Yeah, we can see you, sir.
Yeah. I know.
Visible.
The
She said
camera.
visible.
Yeah. Oh, visible. Okay. Yeah. I didn't check all the appendages. Okay. So you want me to go to the slide on comparative statics, right?
Yes, sir.
This one. This slide.
The next one.
Okay.
In this, if the production costs increase,
Yeah.
the final effect is that the price will increase and the equilibrium quantity should decrease.
That's right.
But the last line says that uh,
Let me see.
Sir, I had a similar doubt on this.
Right.
Yes, sir.
Sir, if the production costs are rising,
Yeah.
shouldn't X be less than zero, X beta?
Yeah. Okay. So let's go through this. First of all, let's make a choice about how we want to interpret beta, right? So let's say beta is like an increase in production cost, right? So then X beta will be negative. Yes, forget about the last line, what I've written. Let's work off this expression that we have derived, all right? So uh, let's fix the interpretation that a rise in beta is like a rise in wages or something. Yeah. So that means it will be a negative supply shock. So if beta goes up, then for the same prices, suppliers are willing to supply less. That means X beta is negative. So now let's look at this expression. The numerator is negative, and the denominator is slope of the demand curve minus slope of the supply. So the denominator is also negative, right?
sir.
So that means we are dividing a negative number by a negative number. So our dp star d beta is now positive. Okay. So if beta goes up, which we have interpreted as production costs increasing, then that will drive up the price.
Okay, sir.
Yeah. Okay. Right. So I wanted to talk about another application where, again, you can see that these very simple tools of demand and supply can give us some insights which we wouldn't have perhaps stumbled upon if we were just thinking about it in an unstructured way. Um, So I'll skip one of the applications. I'll come back to it, the land acquisition issue. Let's talk about social security. So what is social security in the US context? Well, it's basically the public pension scheme. Yeah. So all working Americans, they have to pay a social security tax. And when they reach 65, they get a pension from the government, from the central government, uh, which is tied to their tax contributions, right? So the way it goes is it's what's called a pay-as-you-go system. So the government at any given point in time is collecting these taxes from workers who are not retired, who are active, and that money is used to provide the social security checks, benefits for people above 65. Um, Now, the payments are tied to people's contributions, right? So a worker whose wages are low and is paying lower taxes in absolute terms will also get lower benefits when he retires. Yeah. There's a little bit of redistribution element in the sense that, if for example, there's a disability insurance built in, meaning that if a worker at age 45 suffers some accident and has to retire early, the worker will still get benefits as if he or she paid taxes till age 65. But other than that, the pension, the size of the pension is linked to the amount of taxes that the worker has paid. Okay, so what is this tax? What is the formula? It's a payroll tax, means it's levied on wages or salaries. And the formula is that, it's 6.2% of the wages of a worker. So that's the worker's contribution of the social security tax. But there has to be another, by law, there has to be another contribution coming from the employers. So from your company who's hiring you. And that is also 6.2%. So basically the overall tax, the social security tax, is 12.4%, and it's split 50-50 between the employer and the employee. Yeah, that's how it has been set up. It was tinkered with a little bit, after the 2008 financial crisis, when there was this stimulus package by the Obama administration. It was changed around a little bit, but in general, it's divided half and half. Now, from time to time, there's a debate about this, especially in periods of crisis. It happened after the financial crisis. It is the issue has also come up over the pandemic. Uh, some people, typically coming from the political left, they say that, look, you know, uh, things are difficult for common people right now. Um, Inequality has been growing in the US and much of the Western world. Um, right now, due to the pandemic, unemployment is high, etc., etc. So they say, okay, give some relief to working people. So shift the tax to employers. So let's change the law and make the companies who are hiring workers pay the whole tax, right? So give some tax relief to the employees. And this is to reduce inequality. If you look at the data, many of you may have at least followed it to some degree. Inequality in America right now is at astonishing levels, and work of especially people like Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Says and others who have meticulously constructed income distribution data from tax records, that before 1929 in the US, inequality was very high. But after that, there was a lot of government intervention. There were a lot of programs like the one we are talking about, the Social Security program. It was part of the New Deal created by President Roosevelt in 1933. So all those measures sort of tempered the sort of laissez-faire capitalism which America had. And then it had an effect over decades. Inequality came down. But inequality started going up again, starting from around 1980. So the last 40 years has been an era of increasing inequality in the US. So much so that current levels of income inequality match pretty much what the inequality was in 1929, when the Great Depression hit. So there has been a tremendous reversal in inequality, right? So that's the sort of backdrop, the context where some of these debates arise, and so one strand is to say that, well, let's shift the social security tax to companies from workers, but then people come from the other side, more from the economic right, and they said that, look, eventually it will also hurt worker interests, because now if you shift the tax to employers, you're making it more costly to hire, and that means sort of less job creation. So eventually workers will get hurt if we shift the tax burden like this. All right. So that's the debate. So what should be done, especially if we are concerned about ordinary workers and their welfare? Should we recommend keeping the tax division at 50-50, or shifting it to employers, or maybe the other way around, right? What is the right policy? Um,
So by shifting, we mean about 60-40, or the proportion should be high for the other way.
Yes, you can play around with various divisions and formula. Right now it's 50-50. So you can go 70-30. You can go 100% on one side and 0% on the other side, and so on.
Also, sir, what is the argument for shifting tax to workers? I didn't get it.
Well, uh, the argument there would be that, look, then you are making it really cheap to hire labor, because you're freed up employers and companies from paying the social security tax, their share of it, and that will encourage them to hire more people. More job creation will take place. That's the
Okay, sir.
argument. Yeah.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Mm. So wait, what side do you guys take? Anybody want to argue one in favor of one thing or the other?
Sir, I would like to argue in favor of shifting tax to employers.
Mhm.
Because the way one point I would like to say is, with respect to what you said, the inequality levels are at tremendous proportions right now. Social mobility is at lower news among the intergeneration. uh, and another point I would like to say against shifting tax to workers is that uh, creating more jobs has proved to be, to some extent, empirically not true, because it in a way depends on the trickle down effect, maybe, that the employers would be willing to let go of the increase in their margins, or the capital efficiency that would they derive from shifting tax to workers, and actually hire more workers. So I don't think that can be perhaps empirically proven that it does create more jobs. So I would actually argue for shifting tax to employers.
Okay, so your counter argument to the this sort of job creation um, argument is you're doubting it empirically, right? So then it boils down to sort of looking at data and trying to establish it one way or another. What is
That
the
is true, sir. Yeah.
yeah? Okay.
Sir, but I mean, shouldn't we take into consideration that a lot of these, employers are not necessarily making profits at, the margins, like especially, let's say nascent businesses and things like that. They're struggling to employ, more people if the tax is, proportionately like
Okay. So
on
so
them. Like,
right.
yeah.
So what you're getting at is ends rather than means, right? So you're questioning the ends, that the social policy should exclude, put all the weight on the interests of workers. You're saying that, well, when we're thinking of companies, we're thinking of big corporations like Apple,
Exactly.
but it's not true. There are many small businesses, and there are many people who are not necessarily rich, who run, let's say,
Yeah.
grocery stores or small businesses like that. So their interests should also count heavily, right? But that's a criticism about what should the objective be. when
Mm.
choosing the taxation policy, as opposed to if we somehow agree that worker interests should be paramount, which way should policy be shifted, if at all, right? So that's a question about means. What is the best way of bringing about a certain objective rather than what the objective should be? Both are legitimate concerns. I'm not saying the point you're raising is highly relevant, but there's a question about ends and there's a question about means. Um,
Also, sir, if we shift taxes to workers,
yeah.
will be reducing their effective demand.
Okay, so you're bringing in a macroeconomic point. So if we are in a kind of a recessionary situation, and if you put our Keynesian hat on, right, that there is currently excess capacity in the economy, and demand is the constraining factor, then if you think that, well, if work, so the concern you raise coming from that perspective is that if you shift taxes from companies to workers, then somehow there may be a fall in aggregate demand, and we may get deeper into the recession. That's the point you're making. That point hinges on the assumption that you're transferring the tax from one set of people, namely the shareholders of these companies, to another set of people, the workers of the company, right? And so your argument would hinge on some assumption about their relative marginal propensity to consume, right? If it's true that workers in general have a smaller savings rate, and shareholders of companies who are maybe richer people, they have a higher savings rate, so then your argument would be valid from a Keynesian perspective.
So, following just from that particular point, like given if there's like a recessionary or like a pandemic situation, like our condition present is, wouldn't like a situation wherein where the share of both the employer as well as the workers both can be reduced, and the government can actually step in to kind of contribute a particular share just until the situation kind of favors everyone, in the sense that at least we reach some kind of normalcy. So once that happens, we can actually think further as to considerations, because this could actually benefit both, kind of create that job creation aspect, as well as ensuring that the demand, so-called demand, doesn't fall. Like again, this is a very macroeconomic thing. Empirically, this might or might not work, but just for the sake of providing support in such a recessionary condition, couldn't this actually work?
Yeah. So these are excellent points, but let me just say that we should separate in our minds the macroeconomic angle, which is more short term, right, versus the long term microeconomic angle, right. So if we indeed are in a sort of a macroeconomic crisis of some sort, then there's a whole set of other considerations, and there, as Vibhuti just said. I hope I didn't mangle your name.
So it's Vibhu.
Vibhu, okay.
Yeah.
As Vibhu just pointed out, and before that Atul, I think, that one of the sort of one of the Keynesian solutions, for example, in a recession, is for governments to run deficits and do things like tax cuts or fiscal expenditures funded by with deficit financing. So absolutely, but that's a different set of considerations. Now, if you look at the slide itself gives you some information on that, right? So in 2009, when the stimulus package was passed, what they did, the tinkering that I was talking about, was basically cutting the overall social security tax, and especially the worker part of it. So yes, it was cut from 6.2 to 4.2% for a few years. There was a 2% reduction. It wasn't shifted to employers, right? There was an overall reduction in the tax without cutting benefits. So that means for a while, the government picked up the tab. This 2% was essentially borne by the government, right? And that was for macroeconomic reasons. But having said that, let's come back to, suppose the recession is past and we are back to normal times. And now we are debating the longer term public finance question of How do we want this 12.4% to be divided across the two sides? Yeah.
Sir, for instance, like if we talk about argument for shifting tax to employers, is there anything to stop the employers from just reducing the overall wage so that the end pay stays the same?
Well, the general point, I think, what you're talking about, and that's what we are going to get into, is that as economists, we always have to anticipate the reactions of the various players, right? Anytime there's a policy change. So employers will, when we change around the tax formula, employers will react in terms of their demand for labor. Workers will react in terms of their supply of labor. And the market will adjust. The market, clearing wages would adjust to all these forces. And so the ultimate evaluation has to take into account all of these changes that are going to be triggered by the change in the tax formula, right? And so let's see what we get using our demand supply tools, what answer we get after incorporating the reactions of the various sides in the labor market. So let's start with a simple case, because there we can kind of do closed form solutions, and then I'll generalize that analysis. So for a moment, let's assume linear demand and supply curve. Our conclusions are not going to rest on that, and I'll convince you to that effect. But to start with, suppose these are the demand and supply curves, right? They're linear, A, B, C, and D are parameters. We are writing the price with a subscript. That's because when there's a tax, there's a divergence between the price that buyers pay and the price that sellers receive, right? There's a wedge between the two because of the tax. So we have to talk about these two separate prices. So what is PB? It's the net price, net of taxes, net price for buyers. PS is the net price for sellers, yes? Now, suppose the government imposes a tax of T per unit. So this could be any market. It could be the labor market, in which case the buyers are, of course, the firms. It could be some commodity market. We'll do a general analysis. So the government imposes a tax of T per unit, and the buyer pays lambda fraction of it, and sellers pay 1 minus lambda fraction of it. In the Social Security case, lambda equal to half. But we can play around with many different values of lambda, right? Okay, so let's say the P to be the gross price in the market, right? So in the labor market, it would be wages before tax deductions. In a commodity market, similarly. Yeah. So P is the market price. Let's link up PB and PS to P, right? P is the before tax price. PB and PS are the after tax prices for the two sides respectively. So what is PB, the net price for buyers? Well, it's the price that they pay plus their share of the taxes that they have to pay on top of that, right? So that's the effective price for them. Whereas for sellers, it's the price that buyers give them, right? Minus whatever share the seller has to pay of the tax. Yes, so that's 1 minus lambda fraction of the T. Everyone, it's clear to everyone so far? Okay, so now what do we do? We go to our equilibrium condition, demand equals supply, so we'll equate these two, and we will replace PB and PS by these expressions that we just wrote down, okay? And once I do that incorporation and set these two things equal, I have a simple equation in one unknown, which is P, and I just have to solve that, right? The easiest of tasks. So let me give you the solution. Before that, what are the questions? Well, one question is, how does the choice of lambda affect the welfare of the buyers and the sellers? Yes, that's our motivating question. But separate from that is the question of overall size of the tax. How does that affect welfare, right? If the combined tax is increased, let's say from 12.4% for the Social Security tax, if they raise it to 15%, which is another issue, just to give you context, that many of these countries like the US, they are facing aging populations. So their public pension programs are under a lot of stress because the fraction of active workers in the economy is shrinking, and the fraction of older pensioners is increasing. So So one solution that people are talking about is increasing the aggregate tax rate from 12.54% to maybe 15. So what would be the effect of that sort of increase? And finally, linked to all of this is how is the economic burden? So we will have to distinguish between the legal burden of the tax, which is lambda and 1 minus lambda. That's how it's split up legally. But as economists, we have to develop notions of how, at the end of the day, when the dust settles, after all the market adjustments have taken place, how is the economic burden of the tax split between the two sides, right? What does that depend on? Okay, so the algebra of it, as I said, this is the equation we'll work off, right? Exactly as I explained. So once you solve for the value of P, so this is our equilibrium market price, and it's going to be a function of T, lambda, all the policy parameters that have been set, right? The aggregate tax rate T and the splitting formula captured by lambda. So this is our price. And then you plug back that price into either the left-hand side or the right-hand side, either the demand expression or the supply expression, and you get an expression for quantity, which I've written down here, and that's what you see, okay? Now, let's take one more step and calculate the price, the net price. That's what matters for the two parties, for the buyers and the sellers. So for the buyers, we have to take the price, the market price, the before tax price that we have just calculated, and we have to add lambda T to that, right? So slap on the tax. And when you do the calculation, you get this expression. Similarly, for sellers, you have to apply P minus 1 minus lambda T, and you get this expression. Now, if you look at these two expressions, or even the expression for equilibrium quantity, if you stare at them, there's something, some feature which should stand out immediately. And what is that feature?
So there's no lambda in
No
the
lambda.
Exactly. Lambda has disappeared. Lambda has gone for a walk. Lambda no longer wants to be in the room, right? So the equilibrium quantity Q does not depend, and the price which each side is paying does not depend on lambda, right? The gross market price does depend on lambda, but after adjusting for taxes, how much buyers and sellers are paying, that depends on T, that depends on that 12.4%, but it does not depend on that 50-50 split in the social security taxation form, right? That's what we arrive at. What is the idea? Why is this happening?
So, what is the role of elasticities here?
I will talk about that. I will talk about elasticity, but why has lambda disappeared? What's the intuition behind that?
So it's because the burdens can be passed on to an extent. So the burden as determined by lambda does not necessarily have to hold.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
so I think I would like to refer to the point that you mentioned that these agencies are reactionary. So I would imagine they would have reacted to the way lambda changes and thus adjust for the prices.
Right.
So
Accordingly.
basically, like as per me, even if whatever the lambda is, I think it depends on how respective agents respond to the change in prices. And that actually determines, that actually is the reason why lambda does not come into the picture in PB and PS.
So,
Uh,
yeah.
Maybe when
Rishi.
market finally settles,
Mhm.
then it is the tax that was imposed which matters, and the equilibrium will not be affected by who is paying what fraction of the tax, as long as the tax is being paid.
Yeah, that's the conclusion we reach, right? We are trying to develop a bit more intuition for that. Let me point out a qualitative feature, right? The qualitative intuition, which is that uh, suppose the government shifted the tax from workers to employees, right? Instead of 50-50, 100% has to be paid by employees, as some people have been advocating. So you do that switch. Now, there's a direct effect on workers, right? If nothing changed, then this would be beneficial for workers because they don't have to pay the tax. Their share of the tax is now on their employers. But because the cost of hiring has gone up, the labor demand curve will shift, right? It will shift to the right. And what will that do? The labor demand curve will shift to the left. And that will put downward pressure on wages, right? Uh, and so in equilibrium, the market wage will go down. So there's a second effect on the welfare of workers, right? The direct effect, which is the effect of shifting the tax away from them, that is positive for them. But the negative effect is that the market wages will adjust downwards as a result, right? So the overall effect on worker welfare will depend on how strong these effects are relative to each other. And what our analysis is showing is that they'll exactly cancel each other out, right? They'll wash out. So they'll neither come out ahead nor come behind relative to their earlier situation. Now, for that precise conclusion, you need to sort of sit down and to apply your demand-supply analysis. But before doing that, if your intuition was primed, you would be able to see this tug of war between the two forces, right? There's a tax shifting effect, which is positive, and there's a wage adjustment effect on workers, which is negative. So the two sides in that debate are each pointing to one of these effects, and they're pretty, but we have to bring in. So both arguments are valid, but like the blind man looking at the elephant, right? They're looking at different pieces of the puzzle, and to understand the whole thing, we have to put it together, which is what we have done here. Now, you might say that, oh, look, okay, before that, let me get to another question. Now let's look at this formula again. Yeah, this part, if the tax rate was equal to 0, if t equal to 0, these would be the prices. So essentially the price, there will be a common price, right? There's no tax adjustment to be done. So A minus C divided by B plus D, that would be the market price. Now, when the tax is introduced, look how the prices shift. So buyers essentially end up paying D divided by B plus D, this fraction of the tax. Every time you increase the tax by $1 or a rupee, the effective price paid by the buyers goes up by this fraction, the coefficient in front of T. And the effective price received by sellers goes down by this fraction. So if we add up these two fractions, notice the two coefficients in the two lines, you notice that they'll add up to 1, right? So you can think of this coefficient as the burden that is placed on buyers, and this side as the burden that is placed on sellers, right? And notice, and the main point is that these burdens are independent of lambda. So lambda is how the law says the tax has to be divided by the two sides. But the economic burden is given by these coefficients, right? And they have nothing to do with lambda. What do they have to do with? They have to do with the slopes of the demand supply functions. In fact, they have to do with the relative slopes of the demand and supply functions, right? And as I'll show you in a moment, instead of relative slopes, they can be converted into Abhinav, you are Abhinav, could you please erase, you scribbled on the slides.
Sorry, sir.
Right, so they will depend on.
Sir, I have a doubt.
Yes, just let me just finish that sentence. So essentially, the economic burden has nothing to do with how the legal burden is assigned, but it has to do with the relative elasticities of demand and supply, and that connection I'll show you in a moment. Yes, Nishchal.
Sir, we are seeing effect on the net price that buyers and sellers are paying.
Right.
But sir, what is the effect on the wage and employment of each tax increase?
Good question. So look at the formula for the expression for Q that we have derived, right? Now there, It depends on T, but once again, doesn't. It's completely independent of lambda, right? But if the tax is raised, then quantity will fall for sure, right? So overall employment will go down. But that depends on
Okay, sir.
the
Thank you.
aggregate tax rate, right? Because it's negatively related to T.
Sir, so wage will also decrease.
Well, I mean, yes, wage will decrease, right? It's all captured in these four expressions that we have derived, right? They completely describe what happens to equilibrium quantity, what happens to equilibrium pre-tax prices, wages in the labor market, what happens to net prices after adjusting for taxes. All of that is captured here.
So there is one question from
Yeah.
my side.
Hmm.
The last slide, sir.
Okay. Yes, Anshuman.
So as you said, sir, there is some burden on consumer and there is some burden on the seller, right, sir?
Yeah.
So as the burden is there on consumer, so it will decrease the prices.
Right.
Sorry, wage. It will decrease the wage as the demand curve shift to the left. And so, and if the wages decreases, so there is burden again on the consumer. So in a way, sir, it piles up and there is more burden on the consumer.
You're thinking of the labor market? Are we talking about the labor market? Let's fix that first.
Yes, sir. They in labor market wage decreases, sir.
Okay.
And that also affects consumers in a way, because the labors are in a way consumers.
Yeah. See, once again, what is this sort of overall take here? The aggregate size of the tax has non-trivial impact. Absolutely. If they raise the social security tax from 12.4% to 15%, it will create a drop in employment eventually at the end of the day, with all its consequences, right? But how the tax is divided between the two sides has no effect at all, because it gets adjusted by, it gets washed away by market adjustment wages. So you can, if as long as you fix that to social security tax at 12.4%, you can divide it any way. Economically, the effect will be the same, right?
Okay, so.
But the aggregate side of the tax, of course, has non-trivial implications for employment, for wages, for net wages and everything. Yeah.
Okay, sir.
All right. So essentially, sellers pass on some of the tax to buyers, right? And we have to account for that. Now, let's generalize this. Generalizes the argument has nothing to do with the linear form of the demand and supply functions. So how shall we generalize this? There again, our comparative statistics techniques come in, and you will see that in action once again. So I'm showing you repeatedly some examples, relatively simple examples, so that you can do it in your sleep, right? Comparative statistics is something that economists should be able to do in their sleep. So we'll start with this equation first of all. Okay, no, what I'm going to do here is not repeat that lesson that lambda plays no role, right? You can also generalize that. But I'm going to now focus on how the economic burden is split between the two sides in general, and what does that depend on? I'll address that question with general demand supply functions, right? Not linear ones. So this is the market clearing condition, demand equals supply. And since the split of the tax doesn't matter, let's assume that the tax in question is a tax entirely on sellers, right? Any other division will produce the same effect. So let's say it's entirely a sales tax. And so this is our, demand is not directly affected by the tax, therefore supply is affected, and the net price for sellers is just the price minus the tax. Now, let's define the P as the market clearing price, right? So it's going to be a function of the tax rate. So P of T is the market clearing price as a function of the tax rate. And so now this becomes an identity, right? This old trick. I'm like a one-trick pony right now. Yeah, I'm repeating that trick over and over again. But since I have defined PT as precisely the tax which equates the price which equates demand and supply, then I can write this as an identity. Yeah, and so I can equate the derivatives of the two sides, and that's what I've done in the next line. The next line, a chain rule is applied wherever on both sides. And so I have an equation where I have the slope of the demand, slope of the price formula, right? P prime of T, how does the price change with respect to the tax rate? And I can just write down an expression for that by explicitly solving this. And this is what I have, right? As before, right? This is the more general condition of what we had before, that change in price depends very much on the relative slopes of the demand supply functions. Now, since it depends on the relative slopes, it will also depend on relative elasticities, and that's a very easy manipulation. Starting from here, we can multiply both numerator and denominator by P times Q, sorry, P divided by Q, right? So what do we have in the numerator? We have dQs dP. So I'll multiply that by P divided by QS, and immediately the numerator will become the elasticity of supply. And I will similarly multiply everything in the denominator by P divided by Q, by that ratio. And then again, these two things will become elasticity. So on the next slide, I have that. Right? So essentially it boils down to this simple expression that the rate at which the price responds to the tax rate is given by an expression which depends on the relative elasticities of demand and supply, right? And similarly, so the burden, how the burden on the buyers and sellers shift that's captured in these two things, right? And as you can see, that the general principle here is that the side of the market, which has a relatively lower elasticity, bears a relatively higher tax burden, right? So if you look at the burden on consumers or buyers, nu is the elasticity of supply, and E is the elasticity of demand, right? So if E is very small, and one second.
Sir?
Yes?
Sir, I didn't get that in the starting we assumed that the tax was on sellers, right?
Right.
So, sir, why is the tax burden on buyers equals to eta upon eta plus E? It should be tax on the first should be tax burden on sellers, right? The P dash T that is given in this slide.
That's right.
So why is it the burden on buyers, not on sellers?
No, that's because look at the expression of what is the event, why did I write it down? Okay, let me just say in words. What is the net price paid by the buyers? The net price paid by the buyers is nothing but the market price, because they don't pay the tax directly, right? Whereas the net price received by sellers is the market price minus T. Yes? So
Yes.
when you are changing, so PB of T is just equal to PT. That's why their slopes are equal.
So I still didn't get it intuitively by the way we did from the starting till the end. Like, I mean, I'm
Okay.
not able to get it.
So intuitively, the idea is the following. Here, remember we started by assuming it's a pure sales tax. It's entirely on the seller, right? The tax.
Yes.
So if the tax rate is raised, the only effect on the buyer is through the market price which changes, right? The buyer is affected only to the extent that the market price changes in response to the raise in the tax rate. So that's why the effect on the buyer is captured just by the slope of the market price as a function of the tax rate, right?
Okay, sir. So even though intuitively, even though from starting, if we start from like a tax on sellers, in the end, the P dash T we get is for buyers.
That's the effect on buyers. That's capturing the effect on buyers, right? Again,
Okay.
take a step back. Let's just set the algebra aside for just a moment. We are
Okay.
in a context where there's a pure sales tax. Buyers are not directly taxed. Okay,
Yes, sir.
so
Yes,
if
sir.
the sales tax is raised, as a buyer, initially I don't care. It's the seller who's going to pay that extra tax. I care only to the extent that this will cause a rise in the market price. Maybe the sellers will raise the price. And then my question becomes, how much will they raise the price? That's the only thing I care about as a buyer. And that's why I'm totally focused on this P prime of T.
And sir, even in this expression, the numerator is elasticity of supply and not demand.
That's right. That's
Okay.
how that's what we end up with. Um,
Okay, sir.
right.
Sir,
So as you can see, so just in this expression, if E is the elasticity of demand, right? So if E is very small relative to nu, that means this ratio is very close to 1. In the limit, if E equal to 0, then the ratio is 1. What does that say? That means that in that case, when demand is totally inelastic, right? In that case, the entire burden will be on the buyers. And again, intuitively, that's not hard to see. Very inelastic demands means that buyers are somehow extremely dependent on this product. They cannot substitute away from it. They cannot cut back on its consumption. It's like electricity for our homes or something like that, right? And that means that the other side can pass on the burden of the tax entirely to the buyers, because buyers will buy buy the same amount, if no matter how much you raise the price, right? So a low elasticity of demand means that fewer outside options for the buyers, and that's why they end up bearing a big part of the burden of the tax.
Okay, sir.
There
Okay.
was a question, somebody was asking a question.
So would it be correct to imagine that elasticities are in a way the kind of negotiation power each of these agents hold?
Absolutely. Not in the literal sense, because we're talking of perfectly competitive markets. So each buyer and seller is supposed to be very small and insignificant, and they cannot by themselves individually move the market price. All of that said, in an as if sense, what you said is exactly right. That when whichever side of the market has more inelastic conditions, that means they are in some sense more desperate, more dependent on this market, this transaction, this good, right? So that, in some sense, reduces their bargaining power in the market. So not in the literal sense, but in a figurative sense. Yes.
Got it. Thank you, Dr. Ghosh, sir.
sir,
Yeah.
sir, you said that legal burden actually does not affect how the market will ultimately settle to equilibrium. So why is the legal distribution of tax so relevant in current policy making decisions? I mean,
Um, maybe the policymakers haven't understood it. Maybe they haven't taken the economics course, or maybe we are missing something. Yes. Every conclusion rests on a lot of assumptions. So, for example, we have assumed perfectly competitive markets. So, if you think that some buyers or sellers have market power, then we have to sort of redo the analysis under those assumptions, right? So we should always be circumspect when we are when we are reaching theoretical conclusions. They are useful, but they apply in certain contexts, right? And we shouldn't make sweeping generalizations out of that. So in the real world, sometimes, see, this is always a dilemma. If you think that in the real world, all actors, including policymakers, have always figured out what is best, then there's almost no role for us as economists to take any advice to them. So if we are studying economics and we are worrying about policy and we are spending months uh, doing analysis of this policy or that policy, at some level we ought to have a belief that everything is not being done right. Right? There's room for improvement. So some policies are being done wrong, maybe. Um, so this could be one of those things, for example, right? But also there's sometimes this possibility that as economists, as analysts, we are missing something. So people on the ground, the business people, the politicians, they know something which we are missing out, which we haven't built, thrown into our models, into our assumptions. So we are the ones who are the fools, who are naive, right? So both possibilities exist. Sometimes the practitioners, the people who may choose the actions are making a mistake, so there's room for improvement. And sometimes we are missing something. Yeah, there's one example is of the other kind is that there's if you take a development course, and I don't know if you've come across this in your undergraduate studies, there's this debate about sharecropping, right? Sharecropping is like there are two kinds of when a small farmer leases a plot of land from a big farmer to cultivate. There are various contractual ways in which they can solve this. One is that the tenant says, "Okay, I'll pay you a fixed amount of money. Like no matter how much money I make from the land, I will pay you 10,000 rupees for the season." That's fixed rent share cropping. The other is sharecropping, where he says, "Okay, I'll pay you 50% of the crop output." Yes. Now, Alfred Marshall made a criticism of that. He said that, okay, sharecropping is like a tax. And just as we are seeing here, and I'll talk more about it, that taxes are distortionary, they create inefficiencies, they change the quantity and so on and so forth. We'll get to that discussion. So Alfred Marshall, and when he was writing in England, it was mostly fixed rent farming, and in continental Europe, in France, for example, they practiced sharecropping mostly. And Alfred Marshall said that the Europeans are being stupid because the European farmers, because it's an inefficient arrangement and it reduces productivity on the farm and so on, creates disincentives for investment on the land. And subsequently, people got a better understanding of why sharecropping is practiced. And subsequently, people pointed out that, uh, if the small farmer promises to pay a fixed amount of money and something happens to the crop, like there's a locust attack or a flood and there's severe crop damage, then the small farmer bears a huge risk, right? So sharecropping tries to strike a balance between providing incentives for the person who's farming, but also giving him some insurance against adverse events. So that's how it has emerged. So the point is, the economists, namely, one of the leading economists of the time, Alfred Marshall, failed to see some factor, some consideration, which is why farmers in France were practicing sharecropping. So I've made a huge digression, but it's a very good question that, when we are doing this sort of economic analysis and what we conclude about the optimal policy in our theory doesn't match what people are doing or what they're discussing, well, the fault could be on either side. So we have to approach it with humility, but also we shouldn't assume that, the real life practitioners have figured out everything.
Sir,
Yeah.
I would like to add to this question. So basically, although mathematically we have proved that lambda has no role on the net price that buyers and sellers pay, but I think it might have an effect of psychological effect or behavioral effect on people's mind. So I think maybe that's the reason why the
Yeah.
burden plays a role in the today's policy making.
Sure. I mean, obviously, it affects something, right? So the question is whether it's objectively affects outcomes or whether it only affects psychology, right? I mean, the fact that people are debating it and they're talking about it and there are maybe protests and politically it's like a hot potato says that at least to people's minds it has an effect. Yes. But that's separate from the question that if somehow the policy was carried out or the burden was shifted, what will happen at the end of it? So there's objective outcomes of the policy, and then there's political, psychological aspects of the policy, and sometimes the two maybe quite go in different directions. Okay. Now I'm. How am I doing on time? Let me talk about the third application, because the welfare analysis is the next thing that I will get into. I'm in two minds whether to start it now. Let me go back to the other application that I wanted to talk about a little bit. So let me get to that. So this is a problem which has plagued us in India for a while, right? And this is the problem of land acquisition. So all countries have some sort of law of, excuse me, of eminent domain, right? So eminent domain laws basically say that the state, for the greater common good, has the right to take away somebody's private property in exchange for just compensation. So the law has two aspects. It says that, well, you cannot just, no matter what, hang on to your private property if the state deems that that property is required, let's say to build a road, a railway, or something that affects society, greater society. But society also owes right compensation to the person whose private property is being taken away, right? And I mean, if you look at history, this goes back all the way to the Magna Carta. You find some version of eminent domain in famous medieval documents, including the French Revolution's Declaration of Human Rights, and so on and so forth. Now, all of that sounds good, except what is just compensation? How do we decide it when it comes to an actual practical case, right? And in India, we have had over the last 15 years several high-profile cases. One of the most famous ones is, of course, many of you will be aware that Tata company was building a car factory in West Bengal in Singur, which was a showcase, right, where the deindustrialization of West Bengal, which had happened over the past 2 or 3 decades, was supposed to be turned around, making this factory as a showcase, as a signal that investors should come and invest in the state and set up their factories. But the problem ran into severe conflicts over acquisition of land. Many of the farmers refused the compensation because it was unfair or it wasn't enough. So eventually, and many people would say that led to the fall of the left front government, which ruled the state for 34 years in the agitation over this thing. And if any of you have ever seen this site, okay, the site is situated next to a spanking modern highway, the Durgapur Expressway. And it's about 1,000 acres of land. And this factory was built up there, right? And it's abandoned, okay? So the Tata Group invested some 1,500 crores or so. That's absolutely gone down the drain, right? And 1,000 acres of farmland where farmers were farming, that's also lost because, it's a concrete build-up over there. So it's a classic example of a lose-lose outcome where, farmers lost the land and Tata's lost their investment. So it's a massive, massive social failure. Obviously, just leaving it untouched would have been better, and building, letting the factory run would have been better, because one site would come up with something. So it's a great sort of tragedy. Yeah. So now if we ask the question that what went wrong, right? And this is just the one instance. We have had many, many cases, right? You have the Delhi-Agra Expressway, for example, which ran into similar problems, right? And many, many other cases. Okay, so what was the previous law in India? The previous law was the Land Acquisition Act of 1894, colonial era act passed by the British, which had some amendments after 1947, but those were sort of tinkering. The main framework of the law was set in 1894. And what does that say? The gist is that, well, government owes compensation to anybody whose farm or whose land is taken. But compensation will be at the local market price. So the district collector will look at the data on transactions and assess, looking over the last previous 3 years, what the local market price is, right? Now, in 2013, the government changed the Land Acquisition Act. So there was the first major rewriting was in 2013. And what was the gist of that? Gist of that was the compensation now has to be 2 times the market price in rural areas. Sorry, 4 times in rural areas and 2 times in urban areas. So among other things, there were other elements, right? There has to be a relief and rehabilitation package, etc., etc. Some other payments have to be done. But mainly, instead of paying for market price, the new law said it has to be some markup over market price. In fact, significant markup in rural areas. So what do we make of that? First, let's go back to this question that, okay, using our very simple principles, can we still say something about the law as it existed before the amendment, right? That doesn't sound too bad off the face of it, right? If you say, okay, if the government takes your land, the government has to pay market price, averaging the last 3 years. What's wrong with that? Yeah, it seems like just compensation, doesn't it? So anybody wants to respond to that? What, if any, was wrong with the old law?
Sir, I have a question.
Yeah.
So, sir, when we say that, the government has the right, or as you said, eminent domain, the right of the state to confiscate private land for a public purpose. I mean, what gave the West Bengal government, why did they decide to acquire this land and give it to Tata in particular? Wouldn't that also be a bit? I don't know. It's not like the state is using it itself, but it's giving it to another enterprise, which is I don't know. There seems to be a very weird line here. So I mean, can you tell us more about that?
Yeah. So I guess your question is you're questioning the principle of eminent domain itself. It sounds to me. I'm not sure though. But,
yes.
Right. That. So for example, you could say that okay, if a car company wants to create a car factory, they are free to go and negotiate with farmers. Although we have other laws which put some restrictions on converting farmland into non-farm users, whatever. But let's say those laws have been liberalized, right? So one position that people have taken and often take is that, oh, why does the government have to come and facilitate all of this, especially for private projects, right? The government wants to build a railway line, that's a government project. Well, then, of course, government has to play a role. But especially as an intermediary in private projects, why should there be such a right? Now, that of course has been controversial, and the laws typically say that eminent domain can be applied only when there is a public purpose, right? That's what laws say. However, courts in most countries, including India and the US, they have interpreted this public purpose very, very liberally. So in India, there are all kinds of private factories by private companies, which courts have accepted the argument that if they are set up, they'll create jobs, they'll give a boost to the local economy. So through that channel, there's a public purpose, right? I'm talking of the legal interpretation. I'll come to the economics of it in a moment. Similarly, in the American side, there's famous cases. There's one case, I think, 2005, where once again, the property that was being acquired, private houses were taken over, was for some riverfront development in the city of New London in the US. And again, the argument held in court that this is not just, a private developer doing a project. It is really a project to renew the economy of that small town, small city. Now, but that's what the law says. I'm just saying that, yes, the law is very permissive. On the face of it, it says public purpose has to be involved, but it defines public purpose in a very elastic manner. Now, from an economic perspective, why does the government have to stretch it? It can be, think of a good reason. Well, see, markets are very good in doing bilateral transactions. Yeah. I want to sell my house or my car, and you are an individual buyer. It's very easy for us to make a transaction. But a property developer wants to build some big project. So the property developer has to buy from maybe hundreds of people, and it has to be contiguous. Yeah. And that is what often becomes very difficult through the market. So in the case of Singur, in Tata's factory that they were trying to build there, I think the number of, land there is highly fragmented. Each farm is very, very small. So I think there were sort of the number of land owners involved were more than 1,000. So that creates all kinds of problems. So if one were to defend or justify eminent domain from an economic perspective, that would be, I think, one of the main arguments that such huge multilateral transactions with so many parties is very difficult to get through the market.
So Tata has to approach the government and sort of apply for this, land acquisition and things like that, and then only, through that channel, then only can this acquisition take place. Or was it that the government itself, deemed, oh, okay, Tata seems like a private enterprise that, looks very promising. And doesn't this also result in a sort of a pathway to, let's say, some other social ills, like, crony capitalism and things like that?
Yeah. See, first of all, there's no formal procedure, of course, right? That these tie-ups, this government, backing a certain project, sort of emerges from backroom deals. Yeah. Now, there are, of course, downsides to it. One thing which people have talked about, even if before you bring in sort of more nefarious sort of possibility now, is that states compete with each other in attracting big lucrative projects which can generate a lot of jobs, and that creates a problem of race to the bottom, right? So the states promise they try to outbid each other in giving land at very cheap rates to big corporations, just to get their project in the state, and that can lead to a lot of rents going to the capitalists, the investors, instead of the general public. On top of that, of course, there are corruption possibilities because this is happening at the background. So I think it's a combination of all kinds of factors. I mean, not all of it is corruption. West Bengal at the time was it was coming off a very long period of industrial decline, right? Many industries, the jute industry, etc., had left, and other industries which were more viable, they were also not terribly enthusiastic in remaining in the state. So the government was really desperate to sort of reverse the deindustrialization. So that surely was a big part of the motive. To what extent other, corruption or sort of this sort of race to the bottom is involved is anybody's guess, right? But one can see the desperation of the government of the time to sort of revive the fortunes. It's completely blew up in their face, of course. Now, let me come back and let me just make a simple point or two, which is why I invoke this. This is of course a very rich and extremely um, relevant topic, and I'm not saying that I'll give you the last word on this. Far from that, but I want to just focus on this point that what, if anything, was wrong with the previous formula of paying the local market price, the prevailing market price, right? Well, there were many things which were wrong. Now, let me make the main point, and then I can repeat some of these. But if you just apply your simple demand supply logic, this apparently reasonable rule that market price has to be paid should come out to be seriously wrong, because uh, let me draw the standard picture. So you have some rural, oh god, econ. I don't know what I press which leads to this. Okay, back on track. So this is the demand supply. This is the local land market, let's say. Yeah. So this is the demand for land as an asset. This is the supply. You could make the supply curve maybe vertical if you wish, right? But let me keep it general. So if you apply that 1894 Act, that means the compensation, if anybody's land is taken, the compensation will be at this price. Yeah. Now we're talking about the market for agricultural land. Yes. So if some land is taken for the purpose of a factory, the overall supply of agricultural land what has happened to it? It has shrunk, right? So previously there were 10,000 acres available for farming, and now 2,000 will go towards building the factory. So that's a supply shock. So now there's only 8,000 acres in the land market for agriculture. So that means the supply curve has shifted to the left. So immediately there's an upward pressure on prices, right? Just that supply shock itself will drive up prices. Now, depends on the project also. If you're talking of an SEZ, a car factory, that means that in the local area there's fresh demand for land, right? There will be auxiliary industries which will be set up, and they will want land for their little shops and offices and what have you. Then there will be, maybe outsiders will come and settle. The workers, the engineers, their living quarters have to be built. That will put some more pressure. So the demand curve for land will also go up. Yeah. So just straightforward demand supply tells us that there will be. If you look backwards over the last 3 years and look at the land prices before this project, this car factory or this SEZ was set up over there, that is hopelessly outdated. The moment the project is announced, even in anticipation of these shifts, you can almost expect overnight land price inflation. And the collector looking at the past records and the data for the last 3 years will entirely miss out on those things, right? So this land price inflation is something which, if it's not incorporated in the law, it'll do tremendous injustice to the people whose lands are being taken in terms of compensation, right? And this can be significant, okay? Now, the question still is that, all right, the previous price is irrelevant, prices can be expected to go up, but by how much, right? And this is where the law probably took a kind of a wild guess, right? Why should this price inflation, is there any reason to think that it is 4 times or 2 times or 3 times? It depends on the context. It will probably vary from case to case. So I won't say anything more. I actually had an article which I wrote with Moitish Khatak, where we said that, okay, a good way to capture this is through an auction process, but I won't, inflict that on you. If you're interested, you can look up that article in the Economic and Political Weekly in 2011. For our purposes here, I want to show you that, the debate was often missing this, that, that especially the defenders of the land acquisition policy were often missing out on this fact that, looking at past prices would be utterly irrelevant in this kind of context. So the previous law was hopelessly inadequate, and compensation indeed needed to be increased. And without that, we were having a lot of conflict. And we still have a lot of conflict because we still don't have a very good price discovery thing. But at least the new formula gives more compensation. So that's a good thing. Questions, comments?
Sir, why
Sir,
is the supply?
Yeah.
Oh, no.
Okay, let me take Shreya's question. I'll come back to you, Lydia.
yeah. So, sir, my question is that the new formula which came with the act, is this include discounting the future income that might come from the land? Like using present value of all future incomes that the farmer or the person who owns the land might earn from it.
See,
And then,
you can say that, well, we'll devise a compensation formula which depends on future streams of incomes, payments, lost incomes, what have you. The question is that how do you operationalize it? How do you put it into practice?
yeah,
Because
that's
future,
exactly my question.
right?
That even if we do that, how can we be sure that we are using the correct discount? Uh,
No, but the point is we can't even do that. So and both the previous law and the new law doesn't even try to do that because those things are unobservable, right? I mean, how can we know the future income streams that the farmer could have generated from that land, right? And land has
right.
lots and lots of other uses, right? It's not
Yeah,
just a
exactly.
crop. You can put up the land as collateral and get a loan, and so now you have
Yeah,
to impute
that's
the
my
value of the loan.
question.
Yeah. So these things are not trying to do a prospective, forward-looking evaluation, right? They are looking
Yeah.
at, they are all formula which are derived on things which can be measured right now. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sir, don't you think that the future streams would already present in the price?
That's possible. That's possible. Exactly. So thank you for pointing it out that, one could argue that there's the future streams and things like, the current prevailing price or the price 2 months back or whatever, let's say the current prevailing price, are disconnected. They're not disconnected because the market participants themselves, when they are selling their land, buying their land in the market, before the government stepped in with eminent domain, they are their asking prices, etc., are some, based on what they can generate from the land, right? So we have to operationalize this idea of future input streams, and often current prices, spot prices, do reflect that. Lydia, let me go back to you. Lydia, you wanted to ask a question, and then I'll go to
Yes,
you,
sir.
Sanjog. Yeah.
Yes, sir. I just wanted to ask, why is the supply side, sorry, the supply function in, the land market that you drew, upwards sloping? Why can't it just be vertical? Because, like, at every greater price of, that is offered for the land, it's not like you can generate more land,
You
at
can
least.
you can make it vertical. That's okay. I
Oh,
can do the same analysis. Then nothing is lost.
oh,
So I just do it generally, right? And if
oh,
you allow a lot of time, sometimes there may be reasons why it may have some slope because some less fertile land, less productive land, which was previously left fallow or left for grazing, could be brought in. Once the pressure on land builds up.
oh, all right. Thank you, sir.
Okay, Sanjog, you were asking a question.
I was just mentioning that the future prices would be already like the price should already account for the value streams. The only thing I feel is that the very fact that we are forcing someone to sell something which is not there makes should have that compensation effect of not making that choice. So they should be paid more just because they did not choose to like sell the land.
Absolutely. Yeah. Um, um, how to sort of tie up that thought. It's a very good point that you made. See,
I mean, it's more of a moral judgment more than an economic statement, but I feel like that.
no,
Because
absolutely.
we could have already something planned with that land, right? Like we could have, like, let's say 10 days from now I'm going to plant a seed or something else like within that plant. Now that plan has been disrupted. So with the very fact that you're disrupting my plans, I should be compensated for that. Like that's what I
Yes,
construe to be the cost.
yes. So let me make 2 or 3 points in response to that. First of all, there are some very practical, mundane aspects of what you're talking about, which are actually built into the land. So, for example, there's additional compensation for standing crops. You planted trees, and these are long term. And when your land is taken, you not only lose the land, but also tree and the fruit. So, those things are built in. Just, we are talking of the basics and the gist, but there's some extra detail about the compensation formula. Now, a second point is, suppose, the market price for land is, let's say, in my area is 3 lakhs per acre. Yeah. And I own some land. And you come to me and say, okay, I'll pay you 3 lakhs, I want your land. And my response would be that, look, at 3 lakhs, I hadn't sold my land. So my land is worth to be at least 3 lakhs. Excuse me. Probably 4, 5, 10 lakhs. So anybody who's a landowner at a given market price obviously values it at more than that price, right? So that's kind of another fallacy when people say, okay, there's nothing wrong with the market price formula. No, okay. But if the market there works well, then what can happen is that, you take my land, 1 acre at 3 lakhs, I value it at 10 lakhs, but with the compensation money, I can buy another plot of land, right? So if there's no frictions in the market, then what my personal worth of a piece of land is would be irrelevant, because with the compensation money, if it pays me market price, I can buy up another plot, right? So if the land market is well functioning, then what we have to guess is really the market price. But this point is still relevant, that the past market price, which did not take into account all the change in the demand shocks, the supply shocks, is going to undercompensate people, right? But if the market is also friction ridden, then even guessing the new market price won't be enough, perhaps. You may have to go even beyond that, because with the compensation money, people may not immediately be able to buy a piece of land. That's another thing. The last thing I want to say is that, that there are, here we are talking of the economic value of the property, right? In many famous cases, so for example, in the famous American case, which was decided by the American Supreme Court in 2005, in the city of New London case, the litigants were two persons, two women, right? And one of them said that she had spent her entire life in that house. So the house is not just a place to stay for her. With the compensation, she can buy an equally big house, but it won't carry those memories. So she's going to lose her house and her memories, and the government is compensating only for the house. So that was the basis of the litigation. And another litigant said that she didn't have a job, she never worked, but she decorated, she did interior decoration to her house over like 2 decades. And again, that would be lost. So that's, you know, yeah, she can get a commercial developer and do the interior decoration, but it was her labor. That's what she lovingly did to build up the house for the 20 years. Now, the US Supreme Court said the state owes you compensation for economic value, not for your private memories. Too bad. So there was a 5-4 decision in which actually the liberal judges said, for the greater common good, the state owes you an equally good, equally valuable house, going by market assessment. Your memory is lost. Sorry, right? I'm not defending the judgment. I'm just saying that was the issue. So yes, there are a part of value is economic value, which is transferable, right? Which can be compensated with cash, with other pieces of land, another house, whatever. But often in these cases, there are other elements involved, and we shouldn't be economists and not be aware of these human subtleties, because they also matter.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, guys, I think we can all again continue these discussions. Feel free to raise additional points later, but we are way over time, so I'm going to end it here. Thank you. So see you tomorrow at 11:40. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.